This video is the first in a series about the A-level chemistry topic of alkenes. We're going to have a brief recap of what you remember from GCSE chemistry before moving on to naming slightly more complex molecules. You hopefully remember from GCSE that alkenes are unsaturated hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are molecules that only contain hydrogen and carbon. Alkenes contain one or more double bond. At GCSE you would only have met examples with a single double bond, but we are going to meet some dienes as well. Because they contain a carbon-carbon double bond, this means that there is no alkene that only has one carbon atom. Alkenes have the general formula CnH2n. Alkenes are more reactive than alkanes because the carbon-carbon double bond is very attractive to electrophiles like halogens. As part of your GCSE chemistry studies, you also would have used bromine water as a test for alkenes. So bromine water is just orange on its own, and if it's with a molecule that doesn't have any unsaturated bonds, it will remain orange. But when it encounters an unsaturated bond like the double bond in an alkene, it becomes colourless. This is because that orange colour comes from the bond between the two bromine atoms, and so when that bond is broken so that the bromine can join in to make a bromoalkane, then there's no longer any orange colouring. Before we go any further, pause the video and make sure that your GCSE chemistry knowledge is still intact. For each of these molecules, is it a hydrocarbon? Is it unsaturated? Is it an alkene? This first example here is not an alkene because it's not even a hydrocarbon. It's got a bromine atom in it. Our second example is a hydrocarbon, but it's not unsaturated. There aren't any carbon-carbon double bonds. This third molecule is a hydrocarbon and it is unsaturated, but it's not an alkene because that unsaturated bond is a triple bond, not a double bond. But our last example is an alkene. This one's ethene. Despite the 90-degree angles in the alkene on the previous slide, which actually comes from one of my GCSE presentations, really alkenes are going to look a little bit more like this. One thing that is crucial for you to know is that these are planar molecules, so they're just flat to the page. The bond angle is about 120 degrees. As part of GCSE chemistry, you should have learned the names of the first four alkenes. So pause the video and quickly scribble down what they are. Hopefully you remembered that these are ethene, propene, butene, and pentene. So we have those prefixes that tell us how many carbons there are, and then the ene ending tells us that it's an alkene with a double bond. So when you were studying GCSE chemistry, we would have said that this molecule that has a single double bond and 5 carbons is called pentene. But at the time, we didn't worry about the location of that double bond, and now we are going to start worrying about it. So for instance here, I've got pent-1-ene because that carbon-carbon double bond is on the first carbon, and pent-2-ene because that carbon-carbon double bond is on the second carbon. And remember, it doesn't matter which way round left and right are, I'm just going to count from the end that gives me the smallest number. These are what we call positional isomers. So they're both examples of pent-ene, but the position of that functional group is in a different place. The second thing is that at GCSE we only ever encountered molecules that had a single double bond, and actually it's possible to have more than one double bond. So this, for instance, is pent-1,3-diene. So the di tells me that there are 2 double bonds, and the numbers tell me which carbons they're on. Hopefully that made sense. Pause the video and write down what you think the name of each of these alkenes is. So firstly we have ethene, and it doesn't have any numbers in there because there's only one place that the carbon-carbon double bond can be in an alkene that only has 2 carbons. Likewise, our next molecule is just propene. It doesn't have any numbers. But then we move on to but-1-ene and but-2-ene, and then we have pent-2-ene. Our next molecule is a little bit more complicated because as well as our 4-carbon chain with the double bond in, we also have a methyl group coming off. So this is going to be 3-methyl-but-1-ene. The carbon-carbon double bond is more important. We say it's a higher priority than the methyl group, so we count from where that carbon-carbon double bond is, and this means that the methyl group is on carbon number 3. And then to finish with, we have 5-methyl-hex-1,3-diene. This carbon-carbon double bond is really important for isomerism, and specifically something called EZ isomerism. So E stands for entgegen, and Z stands for zusammen. And these are German words and they basically mean apart and together. So the important thing here is this carbon-carbon double bond, because that carbon-carbon double bond is unable to rotate. This happens when the p orbitals of the two carbon atoms overlap. When those p orbitals overlap, they form something called a pi bond, and this is unable to rotate. And this means that whatever my four atoms are attached to these two carbons in the carbon-carbon double bond, they're not going to be able to rotate around. So whichever two are at the top are going to stay at the top, and whichever two are at the bottom are going to stay at the bottom. Now, right now, this doesn't make much difference because I've just got four hydrogen atoms. But as we begin to look at more complicated alkenes and also more complicated molecules based on alkenes, then it's going to start to become much more important. In order to determine whether a molecule is an E isomer or a Z isomer, we're going to use something called CIP priority rules. So the first thing that we need to do is to identify the stereocenter, which is just where that double bond is. We're going to look at the four atoms that are attached to the two carbons on either side of that double bond. And we're going to assign them a priority based on their atomic number. And then we're going to look and see, are the highest priority groups on the same side of the double bond, or are they on opposite sides? So here's an example of the molecule where we might be asked to identify whether it's an E or a Z isomer. Firstly, I need to find that stereocenter. So here are my two carbons that are double bonded together. And then I want to think about the four atoms that are bonded to one of those carbons. So carbon has an atomic number of 6 and hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. By rotating it around, it's a little bit easier to see that on the left-hand side we've got our high priority group above, but on the right-hand side we've got our high priority group below. So they're not together, so that means this is an E isomer. Here are two molecules for you to have a go at. So remember, you need to identify the stereocenter, then look at the four atoms that are attached and write down their atomic numbers, and then decide whether your highest priority groups are on the same side or opposite sides. In our first example, we've got hydrogens on the top and carbons on the bottom, and the carbons have an atomic number of 6. So these two 6s are together, our high priority groups are together, so this makes this first one a Z isomer. In our second example, we've got carbon on top and on the bottom, so we've got a high priority group on one side at the top and a high priority group on the other side at the bottom, so this is an E isomer. You might get a little 1-mark question asking you what type of isomerism these compounds display. So it's fine to call this EZ isomerism, but you can also call it geometrical isomerism. That sounds very straightforward, but what do we do if that stereocenter has got 4 carbon atoms bonded to it, because then they all have the same priority? Well, in that instance, we're then going to look at the atomic numbers of the atoms that are bonded to those carbons. Here's a slightly silly example just to make the point. So we start off, we look at the stereocenter here, and we see that the 4 atoms bonded to it all have an atomic number of 6 because they're all carbon. So okay, we take each of those atoms and we look at the atoms that are bonded to them. So if I total up all of these, I have an atomic number of 9, whereas if I look down the bottom, then I've got atomic numbers that add to 14. So my high priority group on the left-hand side is my bottom one. And then if I do the same on the right-hand side, we start off and we've got 14 for both of these. So that doesn't really help me. So I need to go another layer out. And then I see that if I include the next here, I get 17. And I get 22. So in this instance, my high priority group is also on the bottom. So I've got 2 on the bottom, they're together, they're zusammen, and so it's a Z isomer. Alkenes can have geometric isomers, but what is the same about those geometric isomers? The correct answer is that they have the same structural formula, but different arrangement in space. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope that you found this useful. If you did, then don't forget to like and subscribe for more A-level chemistry videos coming soon.